It was called Wooden Heresy and the Plywood Coffin. British officials considered it a step backward, and its own pilots a ridiculous joke. But when this joke appeared in the sky, the laughing stopped. Even the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, who in a fit of public rage confessed that he was deathly jealous of the British for creating a masterpiece out of glue and plywood. In this film, we'll show you how an idea that was rejected and ridiculed turned into the Third Reich's greatest technological nightmare. This is the story of a weapon built in furniture factories to play a funeral march for the invincible German Air Force. The walls collapsed. The prisoners fled. The mission was accomplished. In the sky over Amiens, the raid commander, Percy Pickard, made one last circle, assessing the results of the attack. He saw the chaos on the ground, saw the figures of people running towards the safety of the forest. He had just accomplished the impossible, saved hundreds of lives, and in that moment of triumph, death was already taking aim at him. His navigator, Ian Mac Broadley, sat beside him. He would later recall those seconds. Pickard calmly radioed, "The walls are breached." It was the signal for success, the signal for all squadrons to return to base. And immediately after, the radio silence was shattered by another pilot's shout. "Watch out, Pick! Fokker's on your tail!" German fighters, scrambled from a nearby airfield, had finally reached the battle. They were too late to prevent the attack, but not too late for revenge. Two Focke-Wulf 190s fell in behind the commander's aircraft. Pickard was a master. He threw his Mosquito into a steep bank, trying to evade the attack at treetop level. But the enemy was too close. Broadley saw the muzzle flashes on the German fighters' wings. He could feel the shells tearing into their wooden plane. The right engine caught fire. The tail was being torn to pieces. The aircraft became uncontrollable. Pickard fought the controls to the very end, trying to give his navigator a chance. "Bail out, Mac!" he yelled. Broadley pulled the canopy's emergency release handle. He was thrown into the icy slipstream. He managed to see their Mosquito, engulfed in flames, crash into the ground and explode. He landed by parachute in enemy territory. The commander's fate was unknown to him, but he saw people running from the prison. He knew Pickard's death had not been in vain. That day, 140 Wing lost more than just a commander. Britain lost a national hero. Percy Pickard, the man who saved hundreds of other lives, could not save his own. His death became a symbol of the price that had to be paid for the most daring and successful operations. On the ground, the German pilot who shot down the Mosquito reported his victory. He had destroyed an enemy bomber. But he didn't know that this victory was a tactical success, but a strategic defeat. They shot down the plane, but they couldn't stop the escape. They killed the commander, but they couldn't kill the hope he had delivered. For the pilots who returned to England, the joy of a successful mission was overshadowed by the bitterness of their loss. They had completed their task. Their commander had died a hero, and his death became part of the legend of Operation Jericho, where the courage of some was paid for with the lives of others. The price of the escape was incredibly high, but for those who broke free that day, it was justified. Legends were born from daring raids and surgical strikes, but behind every successful operation was a different reality. A reality in which the Mosquito was not a wonder weapon, but a fragile wooden machine flying over enemy territory. Every sortie was a game of chance with death, where the crew's life depended on three things: skill, luck, and the strength of the case and glue. There were stories that never made the news reports. Stories of miracles and desperation. Pilot Frank Clark told of how their right engine was hit over France. It caught fire. The smell of burning filled the cockpit, and the plane began to bank. Below, the enemy. Ahead, hundreds of kilometers to home. They did what they had been taught. Emergency fire extinguisher. Cut the fuel supply. Feather the propeller to reduce drag. And they limped home across the channel on their one remaining Merlin engine. The entire way home was a prayer. A prayer that the left engine wouldn't sputter, wouldn't cough, wouldn't die. It didn't. The wooden plane, crippled, made it to friendly shores. But not everyone was so lucky. An in-flight fire was the ultimate nightmare. The wooden airframe, soaked with fuel, would go up like a matchstick. A single incendiary shell into a fuel tank almost always meant the end. The crew had seconds to escape the fiery hell before the plane disintegrated in midair. Sometimes, things happened that logic couldn't explain. The story of pilot Eric Bill Thornley is one of them. His Mosquito was shot down over Germany during a night raid. The aircraft was literally falling apart in the air. Thornley recalled, "I realized we were going down. The navigator bailed out. I tried to follow him, but I was pinned by the wreckage. The cockpit had become a trap of wood and twisted metal. He was falling, locked inside his own coffin. He saw the ground rushing up to meet him. He knew this was the end. But at the last moment, an instant before impact, he was saved by the very thing that should have killed him. His own bombs. Upon hitting the ground, they detonated. The massive blast wave threw the cockpit wreckage upwards and ripped the pilot's body from it like a cork from a bottle. He came to, hanging from a tree, snagged by the lines of the parachute he hadn't even had time to open. Below him, the wreckage of his plane was burning out. He was alone, in a forest, in the very heart of enemy Germany. He had survived through a miracle that could neither be planned nor predicted. The German fighter pilot who shot him down surely credited himself with another victory. He had seen the bomber fall apart. He had no doubt the crew was dead. But he was wrong. These stories, passed by word of mouth in mess halls and smoking rooms, created a dual image of the Mosquito. On the one hand, an invincible phantom, invulnerable to the enemy. On the other, a fragile machine that could betray its crew at any moment. The truth lay somewhere in between. The Mosquito was a weapon of genius, but it offered no guarantees. It only offered a chance to complete the mission, and with luck, return home. March 21st, 1945. Copenhagen. The war was nearing its end, but for the Danish resistance, it was at its peak. In the city center, in the former headquarters of the Shell Company, the Gestapo had established its main lair. In the building's cellars, patriots were tortured and killed, and in the offices on the upper floors, the archives were kept. The card files on the entire Danish underground. Destroying them could save hundreds of lives and paralyze the work of the executioners. The job was, once again, for the Mosquito. Operation Carthage. The plan was as daring as the one at Amiens. A strike at treetop level. The first wave would attack the lower floors to breach the walls. The second, the upper floors, to destroy the archives. The raid began successfully. The first wave of 6 Mosquitoes swept over the rooftops of Copenhagen and dropped their bombs precisely on target. The Shellhuis building was shrouded in smoke. The mission appeared to be going according to plan. But then, chance intervened. A blind, cruel accident, whose name is war. One of the aircraft from the first wave, on its approach to the target, clipped a lamppost with its wing. Losing control, the burning Mosquito plummeted, but not onto the target. It crashed into the Jeanne d'Arc School, a Catholic girls' school located 1.5 kilometers from the Gestapo headquarters. Thick black smoke began to pour from the school's windows. At that very moment, the second wave of attackers was approaching the city. Their task was simple: see the smoke from the target hit by the first wave and drop their bombs on the same spot. The pilots of the second wave saw the smoke, a thick, black column rising into the sky. They were certain it was the shell house burning. They didn't know they were looking at a burning school. They didn't know that children were sitting in the classrooms beneath that smoke. In the fog of war, in the fleeting hell of a bombing run, they made a fatal decision. One by one, they bombed the smoke marker. The deadly payload, intended for the Gestapo executioners, rained down on the school. That day, Operation Carthage was deemed a success. The Gestapo headquarters was destroyed. 18 senior officers were killed. The archives were annihilated. A few dozen prisoners managed to escape from the cellar jail. But the price of this success was monstrous. In the ruins of the Jeanne d'Arc School, 125 civilians died. 86 of them were children. For the pilots who returned to base, the news of what had happened came as a shock. They had destroyed the target. They had followed their orders. But at what cost? This mistake, this tragic accident, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In Copenhagen, joy at the destruction of the Gestapo lair was mixed with unbearable grief. The liberators who came from the sky to bring hope had, by mistake, killed their children. The tragedy in Copenhagen became a terrible reminder. A reminder that even the most precise weapon in the hands of the most skilled pilots can cause unimaginable sorrow. That war is hell for everyone. And in its flames, it is the innocent who most often burn. In the chaos of the Copenhagen raid, in the very moments when fate had already doomed dozens of children to die, another drama was unfolding. A drama of choice, determination, and ultimate self-sacrifice. Its main hero was a pilot from the first wave of attackers. His name was Peter Clevens. His Mosquito was the very plane that clipped a lamppost and went out of control. The moment his wings scraped against the metal, he knew. This was the end. The plane banked. The engine caught fire. Split seconds separated him from certain death. In such a situation, instinct screams one thing: pull back on the stick, try to gain altitude, bail out, save yourself. But Clevens wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the target, about the shell house, which still stood before him, about his comrades following behind him, about the hundreds of resistance fighters whose lives depended on the success of this mission. And he made a decision. Instead of trying to save himself, he did the opposite. He aimed his burning, disintegrating machine straight into the heart of the enemy. His Mosquito became a guided missile, a fiery battering ram. He wasn't just falling. He was attacking. His plane didn't crash into the school. It crashed into the Gestapo headquarters. His bombs, detonating on impact, guaranteed a direct hit on the target. For the defenders of the shell house, it was unthinkable. They saw a crippled enemy plane, instead of turning away, dive at them like a predator. They are willing to die, just to destroy us. In that moment, they understood. They were doomed. For the other pilots who witnessed this fiery ram, Clevens's act became a final order. He showed them the target. He literally pointed at it with the nose of his burning plane. His sacrifice must be justified. We cannot let him down. Peter Clevens's act of ultimate self-sacrifice may have been the very cause of the tragedy. The smoke from his falling plane, which crashed into the school, confused the second wave. But at that moment, in the hell of battle, it was the act of a soldier carrying out his duty to the very end. He gave his life to guarantee the target was hit. He turned his own death into a weapon. A ram in the name of the target became another bloody page in the history of the Mosquito. It showed what these men, sitting in the cockpits of wooden planes, were prepared to do. They were not just pilots. They were warriors for whom the success of the mission was more important than their own lives. May 1945. The war in Europe is over. Silence hangs over the ruins of Berlin. And in that silence, you could hear an entire era fading into the past. The era of the Luftwaffe's dominion over the skies. For an aircraft born of ridicule and skepticism, this was a moment of triumph. The Mosquito didn't just survive the war. It emerged victorious, having accomplished every conceivable and inconceivable task. It was an invulnerable spy whose cameras exposed the Reich's darkest secrets. It was a daring bomber that struck at the very heart of the enemy. It was a ruthless night killer that turned Luftwaffe airfields into death traps. It was a surgical scalpel that sliced open prison walls. It was a universal soldier that did everything, and did it brilliantly. By the end of the war, more than 7,700 Mosquitoes had been produced. They fought on all fronts, from the Norwegian fjords to the jungles of Burma. And throughout that time, they showed the lowest loss rate of any aircraft in Bomber Command, 3 and sometimes even 4 times lower than the heavy Lancasters. The concept of speed as the best defense had proven itself right. After the war, in the quiet of his office, Chief Designer Ronald Bishop could finally take stock. He remembered. He remembered the faces of the officials who had rejected his project. He remembered the words of industrialists who called his idea wooden folly. He remembered the pilot's jokes about the plywood coffin. And with bitter, yet triumphant irony, he uttered the words that became an epitaph for his enemies and a crown for his creation. People said we were building pianos, not airplanes. Well, this piano played a funeral march for the Luftwaffe. His risk, his stubbornness, and his faith in an unorthodox idea had paid off in full. They had created a weapon of victory, a weapon built by carpenters and cabinet makers that proved more effective than armadas of steel and aluminum. German historians, analyzing the reasons for their defeat, would later write of the Mosquito Plague. They would admit that the appearance of this aircraft was one of the key factors that broke the might of the German Air Force. It forced them to spread their forces thin, to pour resources into creating useless interceptors. It exhausted their air defense system, and most importantly, it destroyed their morale. The funeral march had played out, and its melody, played by 2 roaring Merlin engines, entered the annals of aviation history forever. The war ended, but the story of the Mosquito did not. It ceased to be just a weapon. It became a legend, the wooden wonder, a symbol of how a daring idea, born against all rules, can change the world. After the war, the Mosquito continued to serve. More than 20 countries adopted it into service. It flew under the flags of Sweden, Israel, Yugoslavia, Turkey. But its main mission was already complete. It left its mark not on the battlefield, but in the minds of future designers and strategists. Its concept, a multi-role platform where a single successful design could be a bomber, a fighter, and a reconnaissance plane, became the foundation for aircraft design for decades to come. Its philosophy, speed as the best defense, was reflected in the jet aircraft of the Cold War. The Mosquito was not just an airplane. It became a doctrine that proved unconventional thinking and an asymmetrical approach will always defeat brute force and rigid bureaucracy. But every legend has its shadow, its mystery, and its final, tragic chapter. September 1944. Guy Gibson, the legendary commander of the Dam Busters, a British national hero, climbs into the cockpit of a Mosquito. After his famous raid, he flew special missions in the most advanced aircraft of the Royal Air Force. That evening, he was returning from another sortie, and he never came back. His plane crashed in the Netherlands. The cause of the crash is still debated to this day. Engine failure? Pilot error? Was he shot down? The sudden and mysterious death of one of the war's best pilots only strengthened the Mosquito's myth. It was so powerful, so demanding, so perfect, that even the best of the best could not always tame its spirit. It demanded everything from a pilot, holding nothing back. And sometimes, it even took legends. Today, only a handful remain in flying condition. Precious relics, restored by enthusiasts around the world. When one of them takes to the air, onlookers fall silent. They don't just see an old plane, they see living history, a story of lone geniuses who dared to challenge the system, a story of carpenters who built fighter planes, a story of pilots who flew to victory on plywood wings. It was a wooden heresy, a plywood coffin, a ridiculous joke. But when this joke appeared in the sky, all the laughter stopped. This is the story of a weapon built in furniture factories, a weapon that played a funeral march for the invincible German Air Force. This is the story of the wooden wonder. Its name, the Mosquito. 1941, Hatfield Aerodrome. Test pilot Edward Donaldson, a veteran whose hands remembered the roar of engines from the last war, looks at the blueprints for a new aircraft. He and his comrades, pilots for whom the sky is an office and the roar of an engine is music, can't suppress a smirk. A wooden plane? In 1941? We scoffed. This was the age of metal, the age of heavy machines, the age of firepower. The British sky was held aloft by the duralumin wings of Spitfires, and in the docks, the industrial might of 4-engine Lancasters was maturing, each one a flying fortress bristling with machine gun turrets. The whole world knew a simple truth. To survive in aerial warfare, you needed more armor and more guns. The Americans were building their B-17 flying fortresses with 10 gunners on board. The Germans answered them with armadas of Heinkels and Junkers. This was a war of industrial giants, a war of steel and aluminum. And at that very moment, into the offices of the Air Ministry, where generals and officials thought in tons of explosives and thousands of machine guns, came a small team of engineers from the de Havilland Company, led by designer Ronald Bishop, and they brought with them an idea that sounded like madness, like a mockery, like heresy. Their answer to the Luftwaffe's challenge was not just unorthodox. It was an insult to the very logic of war. Bishop proposed removing everything, removing the machine gun turrets, removing the gunners, removing the heavy armor meant to save the crew, and most importantly, he proposed building a bomber from a material that seemed to have been left in the past forever, from wood. A silence fell over the room. For the military strategists, this was a step backward, a return to the days of plywood biplanes from the First World War. They saw it not as a revolution, but as a risky and absurd gamble. A project that would divert precious resources, Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, from the proven Spitfires, from aircraft that had already proven their worth in the Battle of Britain. The idea was rejected. It was dubbed de Havilland's wooden folly. But designer Ronald Bishop had a different perspective. He saw what the generals were missing. He saw that Britain was suffocating from a shortage of strategic materials. Aluminum was worth its weight in gold. Every sheet went to the fighters. But wood was plentiful, as were those who knew how to work with it. Carpenters, joiners, cabinet makers, manufacturers of pianos and high-end furniture. Their factories were sitting idle all across the country. De Havilland proposed putting not steel mills, but furniture workshops in service of the crown. Their main argument was simple and audacious. Why weigh down a plane with armor and guns, turning it into a slow-moving target, when you could make it invulnerable in another way? Bishop believed that the best armor was speed. He wanted to create an aircraft so fast that no enemy fighter could possibly catch it. A lightweight wooden structure, perfectly smooth, without a single rivet, and two of the most powerful Merlin engines. That was his formula for victory. But for the pilots, for those who would have to sit in the cockpit, this formula sounded like a death sentence. A plane without a single defensive machine gun, a plywood coffin that would go up in flames at the first hit. In the smoking rooms and canteens of flight schools, the mosquito idea became synonymous with a bad joke. And so, two realities collided. The reality of the strategists, demanding steel might, and the reality of the engineers, proposing brilliant simplicity. And at that moment, it seemed the battle was lost. For the Air Ministry, the idea was officially dead. Officially, the project was dead. For the officials at the Air Ministry, the wooden heresy was buried under the weight of common sense and industrial priorities. Why build a piano when the front needs tanks? But for geniuses, an official no is not the end. It is merely the beginning of another path. This path was led by Sir Geoffrey de Havilland himself, an aviator, a designer, a living legend whose name was synonymous with British aviation. At his side was his chief engineer, Charles Walker, the brains of the project, a man whose cool intellect and precise calculations proved what the generals refused to believe. Their theory was proven on paper. Speed is the best armor, and they had to build this plane. The industrialists tapped their temples. The owners of steel mills, the manufacturers of Spitfires and Lancasters, considered it a whim, a diversion of resources, madness. But de Havilland saw further. He saw not just blueprints, but the future. And he took an unprecedented step. When the government refused to fund the project, he began to build it at his own expense, in secret, pouring his own company's money into the wooden heresy. He put everything on the line, his reputation, his fortune, the future of his entire business. He believed in this idea with a stubbornness bordering on obsession. Sir Geoffrey did not yet know what a terrible personal price he would have to pay for his winged dreams, but he was already prepared to risk everything for one of them. The project went underground, into deep secrecy. At a secret facility, disguised as an 18th century country manor, the team of engineers began their work. But the real revolution wasn't happening there. It was being born all across England, in quiet towns, far from the industrial centers. De Havilland had assembled a secret army, an army armed not with rifles, but with planes and chisels. Hundreds of subcontractors, furniture factories, workshops that made grand pianos, even coffin makers, all received fragments of the blueprints. In the town of High Wycombe, the furniture capital of England, craftsmen whose hands were accustomed to creating elegant chairs and polished dressers were now carving ribs for the wings and formers for the fuselage of a future bomber. They didn't know what they were building. Each received only their piece of the puzzle. In one workshop, they made one half of the fuselage, resembling a giant wooden cocoon. In another, the ailerons. In a third, the tail assembly. They worked with the finest types of wood, Canadian spruce, birch plywood, and the lightest balsa. It was all bonded together using a revolutionary technology, creating a structure that was lighter than aluminum, but just as strong. In the silence of the workshops, smelling of varnish and fresh wood shavings, a weapon was being born that was destined to change the course of the war. This was a production line invisible to German intelligence, a production line invulnerable to the Luftwaffe bombers that hunted for the smoking chimneys of large factories. While the stubbornness of geniuses was taking shape in wood, the war was changing the rules. The disaster at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the mounting losses, all of this was a cold shower for the generals. And when de Havilland's team, having already built the first prototype with their own money, returned to the ministry, they were heard, reluctantly, skeptically. But there was no longer a choice. The idea that had been mocked and rejected received an official designation, DH-98, and a tentative order for 50 aircraft. For the stubborn geniuses, it was a victory. All across England, far from the eyes of spies, the scattered wooden components began their journey to the assembly plant. The puzzle was assembled. The ghost was taking on flesh, and the world held its breath, not yet knowing what it was about to see. November 25th, 1940. Hatfield Aerodrome. A damp, raw day. A leaden sky hung over the runway. There it stood, the first prototype, the DH-98, painted a bright yellow, like a canary among crows. Sleek, graceful, not a single rivet, not a single turret. It looked like something from another world. Everyone had gathered around, the engineers, whose sleepless nights were embodied in this wood, the mechanics, whose hands had perfected every component, and the observers from the ministry, men in stern suits, their faces expressing nothing but restrained skepticism. They hadn't come to see a miracle. They had come to document a failure. At the controls sat Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son. Beside him, flight test engineer John Walker. For them, this was not just another aircraft. This was the family's honor, the defense of a father's dream. 2 Merlin engines came alive with a deafening roar. The ground trembled. The yellow phantom surged forward, effortlessly, swiftly. The observers expected a heavy takeoff run, but the plane seemed to barely touch the concrete. It soared into the sky with the grace of a fighter. And below, among those watching, stood Edward Teddy Donaldson, the very test pilot who had recently been mocking the wooden heresy. He was waiting for this flight to finally confirm his opinion, but what he saw made him forget all his jokes. The plane wasn't just flying, it was dancing in the sky. De Havilland Jr. banked into a steep turn, then another. He swept low over the aerodrome. The sound of its engines wasn't the roar of a bomber, but the song of a racing car. On the ground, engineers with stopwatches and notepads frantically took measurements. The numbers they were getting seemed impossible. When the yellow plane landed, a deafening silence fell over the crowd. There was no applause, no congratulations, only shock. Later, when the pilots got access to the machine, the irony vanished completely. Edward Donaldson got into the cockpit himself. What he felt turned his world upside down. Flying it was like riding a thoroughbred. It was responsive, light, incredibly powerful. When you opened the throttles on both Merlins, it felt like you'd been kicked in the backside. He had never experienced anything like it. And then the official trials began, and the numbers confirmed the shock. Top speed, 631 kilometers per hour. That was almost 30 kilometers per hour faster than the newest Spitfire Mark V, the best fighter in the Royal Air Force. An unarmed wooden bomber turned out to be faster than an elite interceptor fighter. It was nonsense, a violation of all the laws of aerial warfare. A plane designed to run away could itself catch anything. It was more maneuverable than many fighters. Its rate of climb was staggering. The observers from the ministry no longer looked like skeptics. They were stunned. Their faces expressed one thing: disbelief. Perhaps there was something to this crazy idea after all. For the test pilots, there were no doubts left. This machine was a thoroughbred. It would change the rules of the game. The jokes about the plywood coffin and the piano fell silent forever. They were replaced by a respectful silence. And then, a new name was born. A name that would soon make all of Europe tremble. Mosquito. 1941. The skies over France. A reconnaissance squadron pilot feels like the loneliest man on earth. Below him, enemy territory. Around him, emptiness. His plane has not a single machine gun, no armor. His only defense is altitude and speed. He's flying a plane made of plywood, and yet he is invulnerable. This was the Mosquito's first combat mission, and its first role was that of a spy. The bombers were still undergoing tests. The fighters were just being prepared for production. But the Photo Reconnaissance Command, pioneers of high-altitude flight, immediately understood what a diamond had fallen into their hands. They took a Mosquito airframe, stripped it of everything non-essential, installed additional fuel tanks, and stuffed the fuselage with the best cameras Britain had. Thus, the Mosquito PRU was born, the Photo Reconnaissance Unit, the elusive Phantom. From September 1941, these lone, unarmed, sky-colored machines began their silent war. They took off from airfields in England and flew deep into the enemy's rear. They flew over naval bases in Norway, over factories in the Ruhr, over airfields in France. They flew where no other Allied aircraft could survive. On the ground, at German air observation posts, there was bewilderment. Radars would detect a single, unidentified target at an immense altitude. It was moving at an incredible speed. The Luftwaffe's best interceptors were immediately scrambled. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Elite aces, accustomed to being masters of the sky, rushed to intercept. One of them was Wilhelm Johnson, an experienced fighter pilot whose craft was to find and destroy. But this target was different. He described it as chasing a ghost. Following commands from the ground, he would enter the designated grid square, climbing to maximum altitude. He could see it, a tiny dot against the stratosphere, and the chase would begin. He pushed his Messerschmitt to its absolute limit. The engine screamed at its peak, but the dot grew no closer. It just hung there ahead of him, indifferent to his efforts. And then, slowly but surely, it would begin to pull away and simply dissolve into the blue. For the German pilots, it was humiliating. They, the victors, the hunters, the aces, were powerless. They couldn't catch it. They couldn't climb to the same altitude. The elusive spy flew in their skies with absolute impunity, as if mocking the entire air defense of the Reich. Meanwhile, at an altitude of 10 to 12 kilometers, in the Mosquito's cockpit, the pilot calmly did his job. The click of a camera shutter, then another. He photographed everything: secret submarine bases, troop movements, industrial sites. It was a Mosquito that, in 1943, took the first high-quality photographs of the Peenemünde Army Research Center, revealing to the world the secret of Hitler's new weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets. British intelligence had gained eyes that could see everything. The enemy was blind and powerless to stop them. Every Mosquito sortie was a success. Every photograph was priceless intelligence that saved thousands of lives and changed the strategy of the war. They would return to base, and their wooden fuselages wouldn't have a single hole in them. On the ground, German generals furiously studied the reports. An intruder is flying with impunity in our skies, and we can do nothing about it. It was a resounding failure of the entire air defense system, and a total defeat in the technological race. The wooden heresy, once mocked by its own pilots, had become an invulnerable spy. And this was only the beginning. The world had yet to see what the Mosquito was capable of when its bomb bays held a deadly cargo instead of cameras. September 25, 1942. 4 Mosquito bombers fly over the cold waters of the North Sea. Their target, Oslo. Their mission, to strike at the very heart of the beast. The Gestapo headquarters, located in the center of the occupied Norwegian capital. This wasn't just a raid. It was an act of incredible audacity. 1,800 kilometers there and back over enemy territory, without a fighter escort. A mission no other bomber in the world would have dared to undertake. But the Mosquito was built for the impossible. In one of the cockpits sits a Norwegian pilot, Ivar Fossum. For him, this isn't just a combat mission. It's a homecoming, a return as an avenger. His country had been enslaved. His people were suffering under the yoke of occupation. And today, he had the chance to strike back. They are flying at an extremely low altitude. So low, the waves seem to touch the belly of the aircraft. This is their only protection from German radars. They glide over the sea, like 4 wooden phantoms. There's the Norwegian coast, the fjords, the cliffs Ivar Fossum has known since childhood. He guides his plane through the winding gorges, navigating by memory. He sees small villages below, houses. He sees the faces of people looking up at the sky in amazement, hearing the roar of British engines. He has to show them that the fight goes on, that the free world has not forgotten them. They swept over the rooftops. The German anti-aircraft crews were caught by surprise. They didn't even have time to understand what was happening. The target appeared suddenly, a massive building in the city center, the Victoria Terrace, a place every Norwegian knew and hated, a place of torture and executions, the Gestapo headquarters. According to intelligence, a meeting of high-ranking Nazi Party officials and SS officers was scheduled to take place there at that very hour. The 4 Mosquitoes lined up for the attack. One by one, they dropped their payload, 4 500-pound bombs each, with an 11-second fuse delay to give the planes time to escape the blast zone. The bombs hit their target perfectly. The building was engulfed in smoke and flames. Panic erupted below. The flak guns opened fire erratically, but it was too late. The 4 Mosquitoes were already heading back out to sea, leaving chaos and destruction in their wake. For the Allies, it was a resounding victory. The first demonstration of the Mosquitoes' surgical precision. They proved they could reach the enemy anywhere, anytime. That there were no more safe places for Nazi leaders, not even in the very center of occupied capitals. For the Reich's leadership, it was a shock. The enemy was not only invulnerable, but brazen. It strikes at symbols of power, at the most heavily guarded targets, and it does so in broad daylight. Ivar Fossum returned to his base in England a hero, but for him, something else was more important. That day, flying over his native fjords, he saw not fear in the eyes of his countrymen, but hope. And the Mosquito was the instrument of that hope, a weapon that brought not only death to the enemy, but also the message that retribution was inevitable. The strike to the heart of the beast had been delivered, and it was only the first of many. January 30th, 1943, Berlin. The capital of the 1,000-year Reich is preparing for its main holiday, the 10th anniversary of the Nazis' rise to power. The city is decorated with swastika banners, a grandiose event has been announced on the radio. At precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering himself, the second most powerful man in the state, will address the nation with a ceremonial speech. All of Germany, holding its breath, waits by their radios. At this very same time, hundreds of kilometers from Berlin, 3 Mosquito aircraft from the 105 Squadron take off from an airfield in East Anglia. Their mission sounds absurd. Their target is not a factory, not an airfield, not a military installation. Their target is the airwaves. Their task is to silence the Reichsmarschall. It was an operation bordering on science fiction, a perfectly planned act of global trolling. Intelligence had reported the exact start time of the speech. Navigators calculated the route and flight time down to the second. The 3 Mosquitoes had to appear over Berlin at precisely 1100 hours. Not a minute sooner, not a minute later. They flew at treetop level, almost touching the tops of the trees. The snow-covered fields of Holland and northern Germany rushed by beneath them. The Reich's air defense system, configured to search for high-altitude armadas, simply didn't see them. In Berlin, in the main broadcasting studio, the atmosphere was solemn. Goering approached the microphone. The announcer delivered a pompous introduction. Millions of Germans were glued to their radios. And at that very moment, to the second, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the wail of air raid sirens echoed over the center of Berlin, followed by the roar of explosions. The 3 Mosquitoes, emerging from behind the rooftops, dropped their small bomb load directly onto the radio station building. The effect was staggering. Goering's speech never began. The live broadcast was wrecked. Instead of the Reichsmarschall's voice, only static and the announcer's confused commentary could be heard on the air. The address had to be postponed for an hour. All 3 aircraft returned to base without any losses. The damage from the bombs was minimal, but the propaganda blow was colossal. On its most important day, the anniversary of its triumph, the Nazi regime was publicly humiliated before the eyes of the entire world. But that wasn't the end of it. In the afternoon, having recovered from the morning's shock, the Nazi leadership decided to get its revenge. Now, the Reich's chief ideologue, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, was to deliver a speech. And again, as if on cue, mosquitoes appeared over Berlin. And again, bombs fell in the city center. And again, the speech was wrecked. That evening, a BBC announcer interrupted his program with a special message. In a flawless British accent, full of polite irony, he said, "We must interrupt our program to offer our apologies to Dr. Goebbels. Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, his address has been postponed." It was a slap in the face, a humiliation that could not be hidden. British propaganda had turned a daring military operation into an act of psychological warfare. They didn't just bomb a building. They destroyed the myth of Berlin's invincibility. They ridiculed the Nazi leaders in front of their own people. And they did it with 3 wooden planes, without losing a single man. The battle for Mainz had been won, and Goering's interrupted speech became a symbol of the beginning of the end for his vaunted Luftwaffe. January 1943. Luftwaffe Command Post. The atmosphere was thick with the heavy, bitter smoke of cigars and shattered hopes. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, creator and master of the German Air Force, the man who had promised the Führer that not a single enemy bomb would fall on the soil of the Reich, was furious. But this was not the cold, calculated fury of a commander. It was the impotent rage of a loser. The humiliation of January 30th was the final straw. His speech, interrupted by 3 wooden planes, had become a personal insult. But the problem ran deeper. Intelligence reports landed on his desk one after another, and each one was like the crack of a whip. Mosquito reconnaissance planes continued to fly over Germany with impunity, photographing the most secret facilities. Their bombers carried out surgical strikes where no one expected them. Their elusive phantoms were exhausting the air defense system, forcing sirens to wail over cities almost every night. And the Luftwaffe, the terror of Europe, could do nothing. Aces who had shot down dozens of flying fortresses were powerless against this wooden wonder. Interceptors couldn't catch it. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach it. Radars barely saw it. That day, at a meeting with his generals and aircraft designers, Goering exploded. His shout echoed through the bunker. It was not an order or an instruction. It was a public admission of complete, total defeat. "It makes me sick to see the mosquito," he yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "I envy the British. They, who can afford aluminum better than we can, build a beautiful, fast aircraft out of wood, out of a material that is available to everyone." He glared at his engineers, the men who had created the Messerschmitts and Junkers. Contempt was written in his eyes. They have turned wood into their primary material, and now they have an aircraft they can produce in furniture factories, while my designers create nothing but new problems for me. It was a moment of truth. The head of the Luftwaffe, a man whose vanity was almost as big as his uniform, was publicly humiliating his subordinates and praising the enemy. He wasn't just acknowledging the mosquito's superiority. He was acknowledging the intellectual superiority of the British engineers. And then he uttered a phrase that became an epitaph for the entire technological might of the Third Reich. A phrase full of bitterness and envy. "They have geniuses, and we have incompetence." A dead silence fell in the bunker. The generals and designers lowered their eyes. This was not just a defeat in the air. It was a moral collapse. Their leader, their commander, had broken. He had admitted that a small team of stubborn individuals from de Havilland had outplayed his entire industrial and military machine. News of this outburst quickly spread through the corridors of power and the Luftwaffe headquarters. For the British command, it was confirmation that their wooden plane wasn't just inflicting physical damage. It was breaking the enemy's spirit. It was sowing doubt and discord among its highest leadership. And for the German pilots, it was a heavy blow. If the Reichsmarshal himself didn't believe in their planes and their engineers, how could they? Morale in the ranks began to plummet. The mosquito plague, as it was nicknamed in Germany, had transformed from a tactical problem into a strategic threat. A threat that struck not only targets on the ground, but also the will to win in the hearts of its enemies. Night over the Reich. For a long time, it had been their kingdom, the kingdom of the German night fighters, the Nachtjagd, the night hunt. They were the elite. Knights of darkness, equipped with radar and heavy armament. Their prey were the lumbering British bombers, trudging through the darkness toward their targets. The German aces were the masters of the black sky, and every night brought them new victories. But in 1943, a new predator appeared in their kingdom, a predator that changed all the rules. It was the mosquito night fighter. It was faster than their Messerschmitts. It could fly higher. And it was armed not only with radar, but with a devastating battery of 4 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns concentrated in its nose. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how it began to hunt. The British didn't send their mosquitoes to intercept German bombers. They chose a different, far more cruel and effective tactic. They began to hunt the hunters themselves. The mosquito night fighters didn't wait for the enemy at home. They went into the beast's den themselves. They patrolled the skies over Luftwaffe airfields in France, Belgium, and Holland. They hid in the darkness, waiting. They became intruders, uninvited guests who had come with a single purpose: to kill. For German pilots like Wilhelm Jonen, it became a living nightmare. He recalled, "Intercepting a mosquito at night was impossible. By the time you got a vector from ground control, it had already completed its mission and was gone at full speed. Trying to catch it was like chasing a ghost. It would just dissolve into the darkness. But now, the ghost wasn't just running away. It was attacking. Imagine a German ace returning from a difficult mission. He is tired. His plane might be damaged from a fight with a Lancaster. All he wants is to see the saving lights of his home runway and finally be on the ground. There they are, the lights. He begins his descent. Landing gear down. Flaps lowered. Speed is minimal. The pilot is completely focused on landing. He is defenseless. And at that very moment, a shadow emerges from the darkness behind him. For the mosquito crews, this wasn't a chase. It was like hunting at a watering hole. They would circle for hours in the dark, waiting for the German fighters to return. And when their prey appeared in its most vulnerable position, they would strike. A flash, a short, lethal burst. 4 cannons, 4 machine guns. All that firepower concentrated on a single point. The wooden plane mercilessly tore its metal adversary to pieces. Instead of a soft landing, a fireball rolling down the runway. For the Luftwaffe pilots, this became a psychological catastrophe. Their own airfield, their home, their sanctuary where they were supposed to feel safe, had turned into a death trap. The enemy was waiting for them in the dark. Every takeoff could be their last. Every landing was a game of death. Fear took root in their hearts. The night sky no longer belonged to them. The hunters had become the prey. And the mosquito proved it was not just a phantom spy. It was a merciless night killer. The Luftwaffe's nightmare was just beginning. February 18th, 1944. A prison in the French city of Amiens. Cold, impregnable walls. Inside, 700 prisoners. Most of them, fighters of the French resistance. Men and women whose spirits had not been broken by torture. According to British intelligence, more than 100 of them were sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled for the next morning. Their only hope was a miracle. And that miracle came from the sky, in the form of 19 Mosquito aircraft. This was Operation Jericho, named after the biblical story of the walls that fell to the sound of trumpets. But here, in Amiens, bombs were to do the work of trumpets. The task set before the pilots seemed impossible. They weren't supposed to destroy the prison, but to break it open, like a tin can, to breach the 12-meter outer wall and the walls of the guard barracks, and to do it without killing the prisoners themselves. This wasn't a bombing run. It was a surgical operation at an extremely low altitude. Zero margin for error. Commanding the operation was one of Britain's most famous pilots, Group Captain Percy Charles Pickard. The hero of the film, Target for Tonight. His face was known to everyone. He personally led his squadrons on this near-suicidal mission. The weather was atrocious. Low clouds, flurries of snow. The mosquitoes flew over the English Channel in France at an altitude of just 15 meters. So low, it seemed they were shaving the treetops. They came in 3 waves. The first was to breach the outer wall. The second, the walls of the buildings. The third, led by Pickard himself, was in reserve. If the first 2 failed, he was to strike the main building, destroying the prisoners along with the prison, so they would not fall into the hands of the executioners. Precisely at noon, the first wave reached the target. 6 mosquitoes emerged from behind the trees and raced towards the prison. They flew so low that the sentry in the watchtower didn't even have time to raise his rifle. The bombs were dropped with pinpoint accuracy. The wall, which had seemed eternal, collapsed. The second wave came in next. Their target was the barracks where the German guards were having lunch. Another precise strike. The building was reduced to ruins. All hell broke loose in the prison. Inside their cells, the prisoners, hearing the roar of engines and explosions, at first didn't understand what was happening. But then, through the smoke and dust, they saw the sky. They saw the breaches in the walls. This was their chance. A photo reconnaissance plane circled above the prison, documenting the event. The pilot radioed to Pickard. "I see people running from the prison." The mission was accomplished. The walls of Jericho had fallen. For the resistance fighters, it was more than a rescue. It was a signal that the Allies had not forgotten them, that they were willing to risk everything to give them a chance at freedom. For the Gestapo, it was another shock. Now they knew. There were no walls that could protect them. If the British could break open a prison in the center of an occupied city, then none of their facilities were safe anymore. Operation Jericho became the pinnacle of the Mosquito pilots' skill. They proved that their wooden aircraft was not just a bomber. It was a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon, a weapon capable not only of sowing death, but also of bringing hope. On that day, 258 people escaped from Amiens prison, and every one of them, for the rest of their days, remembered the roar of the Merlin engines that brought them their freedom. This is how a legend is born, not from steel and thunder, but from the silence of carpenters' workshops and the stubbornness of geniuses who dared to think differently. The story of the wooden wonder is a story of paradox, a weapon that was both a surgeon's scalpel and a blind club of chance, granting freedom to some while taking innocent lives from others. But where is the line between a brilliant plan and its unpredictable consequences? And does the nobility of the goal justify the price sometimes paid by the innocent? This story doesn't offer simple answers, but it does ask the right questions. Share your thoughts in the comments. What does the price of victory mean to you? If stories like this resonate with you, please support our channel with a subscription and a like. It helps us continue to talk about complex subjects.